Yo, we are back and we're running through the desert, playing basketball and flying miniature beetle drones around in the summer sun. It's like being on holiday, and that's great because it's like -2 here and raining every day. So we can escape the best way we know how. That's with some good old-fashioned video games. Today, we are getting our way through Lanayru Desert, one of the coolest areas in the game. There's so much to do here and it's all so much fun. Overall, this section does take a little while to get through though. There's absolutely loads to do, and while that makes for great content, it doesn't help me keep video lengths manageable. So for the first time in this Let's Play, I'm going to have to let go of my personal OCD about reaching certain areas before we call it a game. And we'll get about halfway through the game's best giant puzzle this time around, and then finish it up next time. Today, the plan is for us to talk about the Lanayru Desert robots, who are their own little mystery. And a pretty fun one at that, and there's a little bit about this on the internet, but not a massive amount. We'll also take a brief look at a location that we will get to a little bit later on. So with that said, let's get on with the show, so to speak, and let's talk robots. As you enter into the Lanayru Desert, you are greeted by an odd sight. The remains of something you've not seen before sit on the floor of a small, cube-shaped cell. It seems to have a head of sorts that reminisces a crown, and two large hands sit covered in dust. It's an odd sight, but soon it'll all become clear as to what has passed away inside of the box. You investigate the area, finding a small cart which you push across some tracks that are on the floor. This leads you to a platform which you can jump off of, onto one of these cells, and it reminisces a jail cell. You do so, and then proceed to reach for a bomb out of your bag. You see a hole in the next block in front of you, and if you aim well you should be able to launch a bomb that you are carrying into the hole, and onto the purple stone that you see inside of the jail cell. This is of course a time shift stone, and it's something you've already become accustomed to in your short time in Lanayru, as a means to visit a more vibrant time. The bomb detonates, and suddenly verdant green engulfs a small circle of space around you, including the cell that had once had remains inside of it. More remains come to life as well as the ones in the cell, as a bokoblin with an electrified weapon comes at you. You of course dispatch it quickly, and go to speak with a new creature that seems to live inside the said box. After a brief conversation, he upgrades one of your items, claiming that it was originally made from their old technology. He adds pincers to the beetle that you've had such fun flying around so far. He tells you it can now pick up items inside the pincers and thanks you. The odd thing here though is that his name is just a model number, perhaps one of many LD301 series that were once operational in the area. This little chap is not an oddity in this, as later on you find many more of the exact same named, seemingly mass-produced little robots. In fact, out of those that you meet, only 4 have different names. Those would be Scrapper from the item upgrade shop, Skipper, who you meet as you try to cross the sand sea, LD002G Skirvo, who is a sub-boss within the sand ship, and LD003D Dreadfuse, who you meet as another sub-boss, this time within the Skykeep. So, to understand the robots a little more, we first have to work out why these 4 any different to the others. Going through them in order, Scrapper is actually no different to any of the others, and is there more as an early introduction to the robotic race. You can use him early on in the game to help retrieve the windmill part, which in turn opens the Isle of Songs, which is a crucial area within the game. He's also used later to help enter the Fire Sanctuary, and to help summon Levias by bringing him the world's largest bowl of pumpkin soup. However, make no mistake, Scrapper, despite his importance to the game's storyline, is still just a part of the 301 series. However, he does receive a special model number, LD301S, with the S likely to stand for Scrap. Scrapper, I believe, is nothing more than a nickname given to him by Gondo's grandfather, who tinkered with the robot when he found it. He features exactly the same designs, save for not having claws on 3 robotic fingers, as well as what looks like an opposable thumb disc thing. He also, unlike the other 301 robots, has a large propeller in the top of his head, which is used to help carry items from the surface back to Skyloft. Skipper is also a part of the 301 series, this time being a 301N model. However, he's even more interesting than Scrapper. You first find Skipper at the dock at the start of the Sand Sea, and immediately he seems to be different to the others. See, it would seem as if Skipper has lived a life, and not only does he remember all of it, but he also feels emotion towards the events that have happened, making him a lot more sentient than the others. More interesting still is the translation of Skipper's name. In the interest of fairness, I took a look at translations across the board for all the robots, and found this. The base robots, the 301 series, all retain a similar pattern in all languages, an identifier of sorts. LD in English, RS in Japanese, and DL in French and Spanish. These actually make a lot of sense where they are found, and there has been debate in the Zelda community about what the LD stands for. I think when we look at the translations, we can safely say that it stands for what is actually the most obvious in this case, Lanayru Desert, as in the province that the robots were created to work within. I say this because the other names, RS for the Japanese version of the game, could literally stand in for the Japanese title of Lanayru Desert, which is Lanayru Sakaba. The French and Spanish LD is literally because the sentence structure is in these languages, the French desert being called Desert de Lanel, and the Spanish being Deserto de Lanayru. I do think that other robots were created, even though there's no sign of them, to work in other areas, or at least this was the plan before time got the better of everything within the deserts. Now, what is really interesting about the different languages is what happens when we look at the names of the robots, in particular Skipper. See, Skipper's name still starts with the province name, but then as per the English version, in these languages he receives different nicknames. In the English version, he's obviously LD301N Skipper, but in the Japanese translation he takes a very odd name, RD301N Kukubo. So I then had to try and find out what a Kukubo is, and let me tell you now, I really don't understand what the odd reference is, but the name translates back to a derivative of cookbook. What this seafaring robot has to do with a cookbook is seriously anyone's best guess. I can only imagine that it's a bit of a private in-joke within the development team, and that it then got edited out for the European market because no one would understand. Because of this, I don't think his name has much of an impact as to his origins, but he's definitely an interesting character, in that he's the only one of these robots to have actually had a home, Skipper's Retreat, and he's the only one that seems to reference having a family, with a note on the wall of his retreat that reads, "Dear Dad, good luck at work, Vroom." This allows us to presume he had a robotic child at least. He also manages to process human emotion, stating that he wonders when he'll be able to go home and that he really wants to see his family again. This obviously indicates that he's missing his family, which is an odd thought for a robot to have, unless he was programmed to be different to the others. And that's the crux of it. Skipper's code difference isn't just a difference at where he works. I mean, at first I thought the N might stand for something like nautical, especially seeing as the Spanish name for Skipper actually plays directly on that idea, and the sea captain with a large hat is called Nelson Bot. As for the French translation, it seems to be a name that's just given to him. Isio makes no sense as a word, but it does make quite a cool name that sounds relatively seafaring, I guess. But as we're saying, Skipper's code is different because of how Skipper was made. He was made to be more human, or even perhaps contain the memories of a sea captain from a time before Skyward Sword's 1,000 years in the past. He certainly seems to have a great memory for history, he feels emotion, and even acknowledges that he should be dead with his other robots, and it's only because of the time shift stone that he's not. This really sets Skipper apart really far from the other robots in the game, and it does make for an interesting character, even if he's not around in the game for all too long. The other two robots, Skirvo and Dreadfuse, are just as interesting. These guys aren't part of the 301 crew, and instead seem to be earlier versions of the robots that roam Lanayru's past. LD002 Skirvo and LD003 Dreadfuse are just very old versions of their robotic brethren, and boast several features that others do not. First of all, these two are a lot more humanoid, like the AI we would come to expect one day if robots were made to literally replace humans fully. They're bipedal as opposed to moving on tracks. Their hands and arms are attached to their bodies, despite the hands being some form of weaponry. In general, these guys resemble Stalfos Knights from Ocarina of Time closer than they do robots that work within the deserts. However, both of these are fought during the present, meaning that not only did they predate the 301 series, but they also outlived them by a large period of time, which V actually commends Skirvo on after you defeat him on the sand ship. Looking at his name, the Japanese translation here is actually a really clever play on words that I had to laugh about when I translated it. Skirvo, which is likely a derivative of servo, which is a type of drive used in computing to initiate movement, becomes Don Guerra in Japanese. This sounded like a mafioso style boss, or perhaps a captain's name, Captain Don Guerra, and has a definite link back to Majora's Mask with the Don Guerra's mask. However, when I translated it, Don Guerra became Bowl Galley. At first, this just feels like two random words smushed together, but thinking about it, you're on a ship at the time of the fight. And if Skipper's name in Japanese is cookbook, then I guess it makes sense to reference, as a continuation of the joke, maybe the galley of the ship, an area in which food is prepared. You are also effectively trying to knock him off of a thin platform during the fight, or effectively hit him so hard he jumps backwards and therefore is bowled off the arena. It's definitely a fun, quirky and really weird name for this guy. There isn't much more to say about Dongera, and he'll be forever known as that from this point onwards. But it's interesting that both he and Dreadfuse are both much earlier models than the other, and they're not quite as trendy looking either. Dreadfuse shows up at the end of the game as a mini-boss in the Skykeep, and if I'm honest, he almost feels like he's thrown in there just to keep the memory of the robots alive at this point. He's a very slightly later model of Dongero, and his name in the Japanese localization turns out to be Don Killer. This doesn't need translating back to English to work out. It's not that he killed Dongera, because he's very much alive until you eject him from the sand ship. Don Killer was designed to be the next installment, the next model of the Dongera, and its abilities would make it better than the Dongera in every single way. Dreadfuse has two swords which he can attack with, and a shiny new spin attack during his third phase that makes him a little harder to kill, and therefore he's better than the last model. He's also designed to last longer and outdate Gera, which funnily enough only is true because Dongera dies at the hands of the hero of the skies first. These two are disconnected from the rest of the robots, but were clearly designed to be fighting machines and captains rather than scrappers or miners. So, who built them then? At first, before we answer that question, we've got to mention the elephant in the room. The character models are almost identical, apart from one key detail. Captain Jack Robot has a pirate hat on, whereas King Robot II wears a crown. Apart from that, we're looking at a palette swap, and it does make these two fights a tad disappointing in the long run. Dreadfuse's fight especially. Aside from these, there isn't much in their appearance to offer any insight as to who built these guys. So I'm going to rule these out of any theorising about who created them, because I feel if we find the culprits behind making the 301 series, we will likely find the perpetrators behind these two scallywags also. So, looking at the LD301 series, again, there isn't a huge amount, but there is a little. They seem to wear a headdress fashioned from stone of some form, and inscribed on those headdresses are 3/3 of a circle, coloured blue, then red, then blue again, with 3 lines dashed through the middle of them. Being honest, this doesn't reveal a lot to us, but there is a running theme through the LD community, as it were, meaning that these are likely a clan mark, similar to the Kokiri, Goron and Zora, or if you prefer Din, Faror and Nayru, crests throughout the areas of Hyrule in Ocarina of Time. Skipper also carries these markings, along with what seems to be a maple leaf on his hat and a plume of some form coming out of the hat. I actually think of this as a little bit of an Easter egg, maybe a callback to Tanuki Mario from the Mario series, as a leaf that's not too dissimilar from this gives Mario a tail that looks not too dissimilar from the plume, though it is slightly coloured differently. The markings, however, are almost identical, and this isn't the first time we've seen Mario referenced in the Zelda games at all. The Game Boy games are full of all sorts of little references, so this shouldn't be a surprise, and it's actually pretty cool to see in the game. Again, appearance-wise, we learn nothing from Skipper or indeed Scrapper, so if we can't look at appearance, we maybe need to look at where they were found. These robots in particular are all found within the Lanayru deserts, and are designated as such by their creator with a prefix on their name. The only reason they are here is because of their designation to the land, and it's made clear that the 301 series in particular are designed to help mine timeshift stones. So now that we know for sure that the timeshift stones were mined by these things, let's take a look at the stones. Last episode we did a lot on these, and came to a conclusion that an old Impa, who had travelled from era to era, contracted Groose in order to help search for these stones, and as such that would aid the robots in mining them, and enable the Sheikah then to use the properties within said stones to create items and travel back and forth in order to help the hero of whatever era she is within at that time. We've also seen that she may well be the reason for placement of weaponry in certain dungeons, most notably the beetle in Skyward Sword, and often pops up with important information at the perfect time. almost every time within the game. She's an all-seeing oracle character, who's a vital aid to hero in his quest to defeat or seal evil. The obvious link between the Timeshift Stones and Impa, and the Sheikah in general, is the eye symbol. Whilst on the stones it is more squared off and more linear, the design remains the same. A centre eye, followed by wisps coming off the top of it and a long stem at the bottom. This is why I believe that the Lens of Truth is made from Timeshift Stones as well as the Ocarina of Time itself. But that's all explained in the previous episode in full. The robots, therefore, would have been made by the Sheikah in order to mine the Timeshift Stones. As years went on, time ravaged the area, drying out the land and turning it to desert, which clogged the inner workings of the machines until they could no longer work. Not until a certain tinkerer's grandfather found Scrapper and Gondo, revived him fully with the use of an ancient flower. This is literally the only explanation I have for these guys. But as always, let me know what you think in the comments below. Man, these theories just keep on coming. Skyward Sword sets up so much for us to keep knocking down that we could probably do something within every area with most characters. And today's episode is definitely no exception. We're looking at a structure that is hidden within the Lanayru desert. Something familiar and yet so different all at the same time. Within 4 of the main timeline titles in the series, the Temple of Time exists and acts for the most part as a pivotal area within the game. Of course, everyone knows and loves the Temple of Time from Ocarina of Time. The first time you visit the pristine hall, you're informed that you'll need to bring 3 spiritual stones to a pedestal, along with the titular Ocarina of Time, and play the Song of Time in order to open the Door of Time. There's a lot of time going on here. And then from there you can enter into the Sacred Realm. Of course, spoiler alert, you do this and Ganondorf lays in wait, ready to poach the prize after all of your hard work while you get trapped for 7 years. You're forced to grow up, as at the age of 10, you can't become the hero of time and wield the Triforce of Courage. In Twilight Princess, the temple takes a little bit of a different twist, and for the first time, as a protagonist, you get to explore the inside of the temple as one of the game's dungeons. It's a wonderful dungeon which sees you climb to the top of the tower to unlock the Dominion Rod, where you then need to traverse back down to the bottom while in control of a statue that allows you to access a boss fight within the dungeon, Armagoma. The latest release, not including 2023's entry into the series, Breath of the Wild sees the temple in ruins. Many of the walls were ruined and there's very little left of the roof, and the structure of the overall temple is questionable at best. But this Temple of Time gives us an introduction to the idea of upgrading health and stamina, which is all pivotal within the game. However, like Breath of the Wild's temple, Skyward Sword's version of the Temple of Time is neglected, but not in a ruinous way. More in that its use within the game is very minimal, and it seems as if it's put in there to pay lip service to the fans of the series a little. But while its involvement in the game seems very small, the Temple of Time, located within the heart of Lanayru, could well be the most important location in the game. For an area which you visit for one portion of the storyline, it seems kind of crazy to make that sort of outlandish statement, but trust me on this one. The Temple of Time is just as important in Skyward Sword as it is in Ocarina of Time. So, let's take a look at what makes the Temple of Time so special in this game, as right now we look into the hidden truth of the Temple of Time. The Temple of Time in Skyward Sword is used a little bit as a storyline crutch, where we get to see for the first time a Gate of Time, and we learn just what is motivating Girahim to chase after the Divine Maiden quite so much. He wants access to this game of time, which will enable him to then break the seal on Demise, an ancient evil who Girahim is devoted to. The temple here is still in its infancy. It's not been fully built around the Gate of Time, which reminisces a series of cogs on the main Gira's heavy imagery of the crests of the goddesses, alongside the Triforce directly in the middle of the giant door. When the door opens, it opens out to a stylish spiral made of giant squares, which can be walked down like a set of stairs. And whomever walks through it is purportedly transported to an era 1,000 years before their current time. The temple itself is literally just made up of a platform, the floor level of the temple as it were, and a few walls surrounding it that aren't fully built. There's no sign of ceiling having been started. The temple just is obviously 100% under construction, but something with the temple being under construction here doesn't make sense. The Temple of Time in Skyward Sword is located within the Lanayru Desert. But when we look at Hyrule Encyclopedia, it does a really good job of trying to marry up areas that go well together. It links Faron to the Lost Woods, which makes sense in the long run. Elden Volcano marries up geographically with Death Mountain, which would make a lot of sense if a rename happened, maybe due to a nickname being developed for the mountain. And the Sacred Realm marries up perfectly to the Sealed Grounds. Wait, what? The Sacred Realm lines up with where? But the Sacred Realm is located within the Temple of Time, and the Temple of Time is in Lanayru. Oh, just what in the name of Hylia is going on here? Not only that, but the Lanayru Desert, which houses the temple, becomes the Gerudo Desert in Ocarina of Time, which is the very last place I would expect a holy temple to come up. So what happened? I've got an idea. I think this makes for a crazy story. Sometime into the future, an undeterminable amount of time, something began to stir in the desert. There have been rumours of an uprising for months across the land of Hyrule, but nothing had happened so far to date. Still though, the rumbling seemed to grow louder across the land. Since Groose had left to help mine the timeshift stones, he met, found and fell in love with a young woman who had been roaming the desert in search of the legendary temple. She had aimed to travel, like a pilgrimage to pray at the temple, but had got lost around the vast wasteland before her. She was bedraggled, tired and looked far from her best, but still Groose couldn't help but be enamoured. He wondered if it was just his disposition, the same he had fallen for Zelda years before, or whether it was that she was the first female who had paid him attention in years, or maybe, just maybe, there was genuinely something special about this one. Years had passed and the two had wound up being together, and she had given birth to a number of children. As time went on, the population grew and grew, don't ask me about that, and at first, it seemed as if this new group of desert dwellers would go on to aid the King of Hyrule in his quest of growing the land for more people to live safely. However, like we've seen before, peace only lasts so long in Hyrule. At this current time, there were two rulers of the tribe. Two beautiful women who acted as if they were in sync with each other with every move they made. They ruled with iron fists, but they did not agree with the King of Hyrule, and thought that their people deserved more than the desert. Yes, out here they learned how to fight freely, but that wouldn't be enough. The twins wanted more for their people, and so they would find a way to send a message to the rest of the land, and that message would involve fire and then repurposing. The fire was set in the west, where a building sat that was still nowhere near finished. It was made up of white stone, maybe marble, and had been left unfinished on pain of death, as anyone who dared enter these lands wouldn't make it out alive. Between the fiends that littered the sands and the tribe themselves, no one had been able to finish construction despite attempts by the king to send build teams. They sent word to the twins that they were to allow the commencement of the building, as should the gate appear in the desert once again, everyone could find themselves in trouble, perhaps even dead. But the Gerudo tribe leaders, Kurume and Kotake, did not wish to listen. Instead, they took a small army, predominantly female with some males mixed in, to the west, to where the building sat. At this time, males were born a little more often than once every 100 years, but they still weren't for some reason born as often as females born into the clan. And this number would diminish as time went on, due to there being less males within the tribe in general. They marched upon the marble steps, and with no opposition they began to tear down the stone, bit by bit, until nothing remained but crumbled brick and ashes. But this wasn't enough for the Gerudo, of course. Over time, they built back atop of the ruins. They built a giant colossus which would serve as a symbol of the Gerudo. They built monuments and statues of the twins that ran their clan, and adorned their heads with snakes, the symbolic animal of the Gerudo. They built around this further, making a labyrinthine-style maze in case anyone should feel the need to enter into their place of worship and steal from them the strength had been given to them by the gods. Elsewhere in Hyrule, the message was loud and clear. This land belonged to the predominantly female race, and despite this being an act of war, the king at the time was a peaceful man, and had decreed no more life should be lost to these snakes. As a result, he settled for creating a new temple, closer to the castle, where he could make sure no one was able to interrupt their worship. Little did he know that site he chose to build on would eventually become the site of the Sacred Realm. But for now, the ancestor of Kapora would choose with his royal bloodline to keep the temple close by. Now, don't get me wrong, I know and understand that this theory needs a little bit of work, but I think the basis is definitely there. The only way that I can make sense of the Temple of Time being in 2 spots at some point in history is that something caused the temple to move. But moving something like a religious structure isn't easy. It's not something you're just able to do, especially in the land of Hyrule where there's no access to heavy machinery. However, it's clear as day that it moved. So this means that there have to have been 2 Temple of Times over time, with the Temple of Time that is set next to Castle Town in Ocarina of Time being built, but not necessarily to protect the Sacred Realm. While Rauru, a former king of Hyrule and Sage of Light, claims he built it in order to protect the Sacred Realm, it actually could well have been that it was built prior to the emergence of the realm, and that Rauru was sent to protect the Inner Sanctum. I actually believe this to be the case purely because if the Sacred Realm always existed in that spot, then wars would have happened sooner than the Hyrulean Civil War, which happened just before Ocarina of Time. And while Vati and the Minish Cap and Four Sword create havoc in the next 2 installments, he never manages to reach the Sacred Realm. In fact, actually, the Triforce is placed entirely on Zelda, although it's called the Light Force in this game, and we know that if someone with the Triforce is pure of heart and balance, the Triforce remains as one and does not split into multiple. So this would mean that the Temple of Time doesn't exist within Minish Cap or Four Swords, and the newest incarnation of the temple, located within the boundaries of Castle Town, is not built until the time between Four Swords and Ocarina of Time. This again ties in really well because the Gerudo aren't around until Ocarina of Time. So we have to presume that in the time gap between Four Sword and Ocarina of Time, this is where the race developed properly into their own organised clan. But also this doesn't mean that this is the first iteration of them, and perhaps they've been around in small clusters or even just as individuals prior to Ocarina of Time. The only real loose end is what happens to the old temple in the grounds of the Gerudo Wasteland. And again, that's answered by Hyrule Encyclopedia, as the book shows that the grounds where the temple was eventually become the Arbiter's grounds in Twilight Princess. When I played through Twilight Princess for the first time, I couldn't help get the feeling that this was somehow linked to the Spirit Temple, even as a young Hey listener. And they just seemed really familiar. And both had a theme of spirit to some degree, as well as their location being really similar on the map of Hyrule, so it could probably be a logical step to presume that the Gerudo took over the old Temple of Time site. They built a temple to worship their own gods, built effigies to Twin Rover, whom they looked to as a leader, and then over time, as the Gerudo moved away from the desert, the Spirit Temple then became a prison, which was used to punish and torture prisoners, the same as the Shadow Temple was in Ocarina of Time. As a side note as well, the link with Spirit really comes at the end of the Spirit Temple. You see, Twin Rover claimed to have been around for thousands of years, but that's not possible. People don't live for thousands of years. So, is it possible more that Twin Rover are spirits, ghosts of the former leaders? Which is how come they can fly so easily? Which is how come they take on a witch-like appearance? And how come they can fuse together? It could well be that Twin Rover are in fact not alive. They're ghosts of a past, so to speak. In general, it's theories like this, being honest about it, that made me start this series to begin with, as I believe this game was literally designed to link all of the Zelda games together. When I first played through it, I got this overwhelming sense that while this game is designed to tell the backstory of the legendary Master Sword, it also tells the story of the world, and the changes that the world goes through, to then accommodate games such as Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess. I find this fascinating, as it gives us a chance to explore so much further than we'd get to with a normal game series, especially one that tells us everything and holds our hands through the game. But with all of that being said, I think we're going to have to call it a game here. So next time, we're going to finish this very long but awesome puzzle, and then we're going to get ourselves into the 3rd dungeon of the game. And trust me on this, the dungeons only get better and better and better through this game. So, I'll see you next time. See ya!